Welcome back to Unchained Stories, where history's forgotten truths finally breathe again. Tonight, we pull back the velvet curtain on one of the strangest, most misunderstood tales in the history of medicine. A story that connects Victorian doctors, female sexuality, pseudoscience, and the invention of one of the most controversial household devices ever created. You've probably heard the popular version. Victorian women were diagnosed with hysteria, a mysterious illness blamed on sexual frustration. Doctors treated them by manually stimulating them to orgasm. The process was exhausting, so physicians invented early mechanical vibrators to make their work easier. Eventually, those same devices slipped out of medical offices and into bedrooms. That's the legend. It's been told in documentaries, magazines, and even Hollywood's 2011 film, Hysteria. But the truth is far darker, and far more revealing about how medicine has been used to control women's bodies for centuries. Because the real story isn't about medical innovation. It's about how science, cloaked in authority, pathologized female desire, labeling it illness, diagnosing it as madness, and prescribing male control as the cure. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to learn exposes how pseudoscience becomes accepted medicine, and how women's bodies became battlefields for power, profit, and patriarchy. Let's go back far before Victorian England, to where this myth began, ancient Greece 2,400 years ago. The man we still call the father of medicine, Hippocrates, wrote about a strange affliction that supposedly affected only women. He named it hysteria, from the Greek word hystera, meaning uterus. According to him, this mysterious illness occurred when a woman's uterus began to wander through her body. Yes, you heard that right. Ancient doctors believed the womb could move like an animal, roaming inside a woman's body, pressing on her organs, and causing chaos wherever it went. If it drifted upward toward the chest, it caused choking and anxiety. If it crept toward the head, it caused fainting and madness. The womb, they believed, was a creature that could not survive dryness. And what kept it moist and still? Sexual intercourse and when pregnancy. So the cure, naturally, was marriage. If a woman was unmarried, widowed, or celibate, doctors said her womb might become restless, and that restlessness was disease. This meant that from the very beginning of medical history, female health was tied to male access. Hysteria wasn't just a diagnosis, it was a command. Be a wife. Be a mother. Be available. Women who couldn't marry were treated with pungent herbs, oils, and sometimes, yes, genital massage by midwives, meant to calm the womb. It was never about healing. It was about control. The idea of hysteria didn't die with Greece. Roman physicians took it up next, giving it new names but the same purpose. Through the Middle Ages, doctors blamed hysteria on demons, moral weakness, or divine punishment. By the Renaissance, hysteria had become a medical catch-all for everything male physicians didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, about women. A woman too emotional? Hysterical. Too silent? Hysterical. Not interested in sex? Hysterical. Too interested in sex? Also hysterical. It was the perfect diagnosis, vague, unprovable, and profitable. Then came the Victorian era, 1837 to 1901, when hysteria reached its full, grotesque bloom under Queen Victoria's reign. Society wrapped women in lace, morality, and silence. They were expected to be pure, passive, obedient, angels in the house. A respectable woman was not supposed to desire sex. She existed to fulfill her husband's duty, not her own pleasure. But real women, of course, had desires, frustrations, ambitions, and anger. They wanted more than endless domestic confinement. So when women broke under the weight of those impossible standards, when they wept, protested, or even simply wanted, medicine stepped in to declare them ill. By the late 19th century, hysteria had become the most commonly diagnosed disease among women. Medical texts claimed that 3/4 of all women would suffer from it at some point. But the symptoms? They included almost everything. Anxiety, depression, fatigue, loss of appetite, insomnia, even too much imagination. In truth, hysteria was not a disease of the body. It was a reflection of a society that made women sick. Rather than ask why so many women were anxious or miserable, doctors decided there must be something wrong with them. And what was the treatment? It ranged from absurd to cruel. Some physicians prescribed the rest cure. Total isolation in a dark room, no reading, no writing, no conversation. Women confined to bed until their will was broken. Others recommended hydrotherapy, powerful, jets of water aimed at the genitals to restore balance. Still others observed that vibration helped relieve symptoms, suggesting horseback riding or cycling as therapy. Behind these clinical terms was a pattern, the same one that began in ancient Greece. When women's emotions became inconvenient, male authority medicalized them. Victorian medicine didn't cure hysteria. It used it to silence, to control, to remind every woman that her mind, her pleasure, and even her sanity were property of men in white coats. Voice softens, camera zooms in. This is only the beginning of the story, because what happens next will take us into the heart of Victorian medicine, where the line between treatment and exploitation blurred completely. And it's where the world's first mechanical vibrators appeared, not as tools of liberation, but as instruments of control masquerading as care. Let's talk about what really happened inside those pristine, gaslit Victorian clinics. In the 19th century, the female body was a mystery men claimed to understand, and a problem they believed they could fix. Doctors prescribed all manner of strange cures for hysteria. Some recommended tonics laced with alcohol or opium. Others swore by cold baths, electric shocks, or horseback riding. But there was one treatment that stood out, one that history still struggles to talk about honestly. It was called pelvic massage or medical massage. In reality, it meant manual genital stimulation performed by physicians until the patient reached what they called a hysterical paroxysm. Let's be absolutely clear. That word, paroxysm, was a euphemism. It meant orgasm. Yes, doctors were bringing women to orgasm and calling it medicine, but they never used the word sexuality, never acknowledged pleasure. They described it as a therapeutic crisis, a temporary convulsion that supposedly released nervous tension and restored balance to the female body. Victorian medicine was obsessed with redefining sexual relief as treatment. So long as the act was framed as clinical, a physician could do what no husband or lover could admit to. The language itself became the disguise, an armor of Latin phrases and medical detachment that kept everything respectable. It was a semantic sleight of hand that allowed doctors to touch women's most private places under the guise of curing them. Now, here's the crucial question. Did this really happen as widely as we've been told? For decades, popular history has claimed it did, that half of Victorian England's doctors were treating hysteria through manual stimulation, and that when they grew tired of the physical effort, they invented the vibrator to save their hands. That version comes primarily from a 1999 book called The Technology of Orgasm by historian Rachel Maines. Her argument was bold and unforgettable. Doctors across Europe and America commonly used manual genital massage to treat women, and mechanical vibrators were invented to make that process faster and easier. The idea was sensational, and it spread like wildfire. Documentaries, museum exhibits, and the 2011 film Hysteria all repeated it as fact. But in recent years, historians have started pushing back. They argue the evidence for this universal practice is thinner than we were led to believe. Many of the 19th century medical texts Maines cited used vague, coded language. Words like massage, nervous stimulation, or pelvic therapy. None explicitly described orgasm. In 2018, 2 researchers published a detailed critique, claiming the vibrator hysteria connection was mostly a myth. Their argument: there's little solid proof that genital massage was routine medical practice, and that early vibrators were marketed for all kinds of nervous conditions, not exclusively sexual ones. So what's the truth? As with most of history's taboos, it's complicated. Here's what we do know. First, hysteria was absolutely real as a diagnosis. It appears in thousands of 19th century medical records across Britain, France, and America. Doctors wrote endlessly about it, debated its causes, and prescribed countless treatments. Second, some physicians, particularly in France and Britain, explicitly described pelvic massage as therapy. Dr. Pierre Briquet, writing in 1859, referred to manual massage of the genital area. British surgeon Isaac Baker Brown, a decade later, wrote about similar procedures. Third, Victorian women did seek these treatments. Letters and case reports describe female patients who claimed to feel relieved after therapy sessions. Given what we know now about sexual frustration and repression, it's not difficult to imagine why. Fourth, by the 1880s, mechanical vibrators existed and were marketed directly to physicians. Advertisements appeared in medical journals and equipment catalogs, promoting electromechanical massage devices for the treatment of nervous exhaustion and female complaints. These devices were not cheap toys. They were professional tools, large, heavy, and expensive, meant for medical offices. They were powered by foot pedals, steam, or early electricity. And though their advertisements were draped in medical jargon, their purpose was hard to misinterpret. One ad from 1885 boasts, relieves congestion of pelvic organs, restores vitality, safe for home use under physician guidance. The euphemism was so transparent it was almost farcical. But what we don't know is how widespread these practices truly were. Was genital massage a standard part of every doctor's hysteria treatment? Probably not. Was it a known but discreet method used by some physicians? Almost certainly. Did every doctor understand what he was doing sexually? That's harder to say. Some may have genuinely believed they were treating a nervous disorder. Others likely knew the truth and exploited the silence surrounding female pleasure. What's certain is that Victorian medicine turned women's desire into disease and then monetized the cure. Hysteria became a self-perpetuating business. It medicalized the emotional toll of being a woman in a repressive society. Women who were overworked, underloved, and silenced, and turned their suffering into profit. Instead of asking why women were anxious, depressed, or sexually unfulfilled, doctors simply declared them ill and prescribed themselves as the solution. And when that solution included orgasmic release, so long as it happened in a doctor's office, it wasn't sin or scandal. It was therapy. In the twisted logic of Victorian morality, female sexuality could exist only if it was disguised as illness and controlled by men in lab coats. The doctor became gatekeeper, the one who defined desire, diagnosed deviance, and prescribed pleasure only when wrapped in medical language. That's the real story. Not whether vibrators were used for hysteria, but how a society so terrified of women's autonomy created an entire medical system to contain it. So where does that leave us? By the 1880s, the stage was set for one of the most fascinating transitions in the history of medicine and technology, when these therapeutic machines quietly crossed from doctors' offices into private homes. Next, we'll trace how the mechanical vibrator evolved from a clinical invention to a consumer product, and how manufacturers managed to sell sexual pleasure to the masses while pretending it had nothing to do with sex at all. By the end of the 19th century, the line between medicine and desire was buzzing, literally. These early devices weren't sold as anything sexual, at least not officially. They were presented as therapeutic tools designed to restore vitality, calm the nerves, and invigorate circulation. Manufacturers claimed their machines could treat everything from indigestion to back pain, yet everyone who saw their design understood they could do much more. The first true mechanical vibrator, something recognizable even today, was created in the early 1880s by a British physician named Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville. In 1883, he patented a handheld electromechanical massager powered by batteries and electromagnetic coils. It was one of the first portable electric appliances ever made. Granville called it the percuteur, and he insisted it was for medical use only. His writings describe how he used it to treat muscle fatigue, neuralgia, and nervous disorders. But he also made something else clear. He explicitly refused to use the device on female patients suffering from hysteria. In fact, he warned other physicians not to use it for pelvic conditions, calling that wholly inappropriate. And yet, within a decade, other doctors were doing exactly that. This contradiction sits at the heart of the vibrator's origin story. The inventor condemned its use for women's hysteria, but the market ignored him, realizing just how profitable that application could be. By the 1890s, companies across Europe and America were manufacturing mechanical vibrators and promoting them specifically for female nervous conditions. These machines were marvels of engineering for their time. Sleek, polished, and terrifyingly sophisticated. Large and expensive, they belonged to medical clinics, not homes. Each unit had an electric motor or clockwork mechanism connected to interchangeable attachments, rounded heads for general massage, pointed ones for localized pressure, curved ends for deeper stimulation. Some were powered by electricity, others by foot pedals, even by water pressure. And though their manuals never dared to say it outright, a few attachments were clearly designed for intimate application. In an era that barely allowed women to discuss their own bodies, these devices sold for between $150 and $200, the equivalent of $4,000 to $5,000 today. They were luxury instruments, scientific, respectable, and above all, plausible. The advertising was a masterpiece of coded language. No ad ever used the word pleasure. Instead, they promised soothing relief, nervous calm, and restored feminine balance. Pamphlets spoke of restoring pelvic circulation and relieving congestion of the uterus. Doctors could claim professional detachment. Patients could claim medical need. And so the illusion held. No sin, no scandal, just science. The scheme was brilliant. Each treatment took 20-30 minutes and required multiple sessions a week. A single device could treat dozens of women, paying for itself within months. As profits soared, so did the number of women diagnosed with hysteria. Medicine had turned desire into business, but the real revolution came around 1900, when these machines quietly escaped the clinic. For the first time, vibrators began appearing in ordinary homes. Mail-order catalogs, the Amazon of their day, listed electrical massagers under the category of domestic appliances. The Sears Roebuck catalog featured them beside sewing machines and hair dryers. Montgomery Ward soon followed, offering cheaper, battery-powered models. By 1910, more than 20 different designs were available to the public, priced between $5 and $15, affordable to middle-class women. And the marketing? Nothing short of genius. Ads appeared in Ladies' Home Journal, Woman's Home Companion, and McClure's magazine. Elegant illustrations showed women gently pressing the devices to their cheeks, shoulders or necks, fully clothed, serene, respectable. But inside the packaging, customers found a variety of attachments, some curved, some rounded, some shaped for areas not shown in the pictures, everyone knew. And yet no one said a word. The plausible deniability was the point. As long as advertisements used vague words like beauty, health, and vitality, the devices could be sold in plain sight, right next to curling irons and kitchen mixers. Behind closed doors, Victorian women, many of them trapped in marriages where passion was forbidden, had found a quiet revolution disguised as a medical device. For nearly 2 decades, from 1900 to 1920, this double life continued. Tens of thousands of women owned vibrators that looked like medical instruments, but functioned as something else entirely. They existed in a society that banned contraception, censored sexual education, and punished female desire. The illusion of therapy protected them all, the doctors, the manufacturers, and the women who used them. The system depended on one shared lie, that these machines were therapeutic, not erotic, but the illusion couldn't last. By the early 1920s, 2 things destroyed the cover. First, vibrators started appearing in early pornographic films. Once the devices were shown in a sexual context, their medical respectability evaporated overnight. No amount of coded language could hide what everyone had now seen. Second, the entire foundation, the diagnosis of hysteria, collapsed. Psychologists like Sigmund Freud argued that hysteria wasn't a physical illness at all, but a manifestation of emotional repression. By the mid-1920s, doctors had stopped diagnosing hysteria entirely. And without hysteria, there was no longer a legitimate reason to use these devices. Manufacturers adapted quickly. They rebranded vibrators as muscle relaxers, beauty aids, and facial massagers. By 1925, they had vanished from women's magazines and mainstream stores. For decades afterward, they lived in the shadows, still sold, still used, but quietly, discreetly, stripped of medical legitimacy. Then came the 1960s. The world changed. Feminism, sexual liberation, and new ideas about the body challenged everything Victorian morality had built. And with that cultural shift, the vibrator returned. The most iconic model, the Hitachi Magic Wand, arrived in 1968. Marketed as a personal massager, it once again blurred the line between medicine and pleasure. This time, though, the public wasn't pretending. People knew what it was, and they embraced it. By the late 20th century, the vibrator had completed its transformation from a secret tool of repression to an open symbol of autonomy and self-pleasure. What began as a medical instrument to control women's bodies became a device that helped them reclaim them. Today, the hum of the vibrator echoes across a billion-dollar industry, but hidden beneath that sound is the ghost of its origin. Yes, the vibrator is now a symbol of sexual empowerment. It's openly marketed, celebrated, and discussed in places Victorian women could never have imagined. But behind this modern triumph lies an irony so deep it's almost tragic. Because the vibrator's first purpose wasn't liberation, it was control. It began not as a celebration of female autonomy, but as a mechanism to contain it. Wrapped in the sterile language of medicine, the device offered women relief only through a male-controlled lens. Victorian women weren't allowed to desire. They couldn't discuss pleasure, couldn't touch themselves without shame, but they could see a doctor. They could be diagnosed with hysteria, and that diagnosis gave male physicians the authority to do what society forbade women from doing for themselves. Women couldn't seek pleasure. They had to seek treatment. They couldn't have orgasms. They had to experience hysterical paroxysms. Every act of female sexual release had to pass through a male gatekeeper, defined, approved, and monetized by the medical establishment. Male doctors decided when treatment was necessary. Male inventors built the machines. Male manufacturers sold them. Male retailers distributed them. Even when vibrators reached the home, their language remained medical. They were health devices, not sex toys. Therapy, not desire. Treatment, not pleasure. It was progress, but progress on a leash. This wasn't liberation. It was permission, granted only under male supervision. And that pattern, the medicalization of women's bodies and sexuality, didn't end with hysteria. It never really does. Look around. The echoes are still there. Birth control was illegal until doctors could prescribe it. Abortion access still depends on medical authorization. Female sexual dysfunction is defined by committees dominated by male researchers. Plastic surgery for women is framed as corrective medicine, not personal choice. The script hasn't changed, only the vocabulary. The story of hysteria and the vibrator is part of a much larger pattern. When women claim agency over their bodies, society often responds by wrapping that agency in medical terms, by turning autonomy into diagnosis, and desire into disorder. So let's break down some myths, because understanding this history means confronting its complexity. First, did Victorian women know they were having orgasms? Some did, absolutely. Others, sheltered from any real sexual education, may have felt pleasure without fully understanding it. Victorian doctors avoided the word orgasm like a curse, but private letters and diaries reveal women who understood their bodies far better than society wanted to believe. Second, were doctors sexually exploiting their patients? The answer is layered. Some surely knew exactly what they were doing and enjoyed the power it gave them. Others may have sincerely believed they were practicing legitimate medicine. But the system itself was exploitative because it denied women control over their own sexuality, cloaking that denial in science. Third, was the vibrator invented for hysteria? Not exactly. It was born from broader experiments in electromechanical medicine. But its adoption into hysteria treatment was significant and lucrative enough to rewrite its legacy. Fourth, are modern vibrators connected to that history? Only historically. Today's devices are proudly, explicitly sexual, symbols of agency, not treatment. Yet knowing where they came from helps us recognize how medicine once policed women's pleasure, instead of empowering it. And fifth, should we thank those doctors for accidentally helping women achieve pleasure? Absolutely not. This wasn't a happy accident. It was control disguised as care. The fact that women found relief doesn't erase the system that denied them the right to seek that relief freely. This story is more than a quirky footnote in sexual history. It's a mirror held up to the present. Even today, women's bodies are scrutinized, judged, and corrected under the banner of medicine. A woman who desires too much? She's hypersexual. Too little? Hypoactive sexual desire disorder. Too confident in her body? Needs reduction surgery. Too dissatisfied? Needs enhancement. The language has evolved, but the control remains. Pharmaceutical companies chase female Viagra, selling the promise of a pill that can fix women's desire, as if desire were a symptom, not a choice. The industry profits from defining normal human experience as pathology. The same cycle continues: diagnose, medicalize, monetize. And that's the true legacy of hysteria and the vibrator. It's not just about strange doctors and eccentric machines. It's about how power, profit, and patriarchy shape the language of health itself. Victorian doctors earned money by treating imaginary illnesses. Manufacturers profited from devices built to heal female desire. Today, entire industries still profit by turning women's natural diversity into medical problems. Understanding. This story doesn't just teach history, it teaches resistance. It shows why skepticism toward medical authority, especially when it concerns women's bodies, is not rebellion but reason. It reminds us that what's called disorder often reflects cultural discomfort, not biological reality. And it reveals how science can be used not only to heal, but to control. So let's ask the question one last time. Is the vibrator hysteria story harmful because it's been simplified? Not exactly, just incomplete. Yes, the popular tale of doctors inventing vibrators to treat hysteria makes for an entertaining headline. It even sounds empowering, but that framing turns oppression into comedy. It erases the deeper truth, that medicine once served as a mask for patriarchy. The real story isn't cute. It's not funny. It's unsettling. It's about how authority can redefine control as care, and how easily society accepts it. If you've stayed with us to the end of this investigation, thank you, because what you've just heard isn't about a single device or a forgotten diagnosis. It's about power, about how entire systems were built to dictate what women could feel, want, or even name. The history of hysteria and the vibrator is the history of how women's bodies were turned into battlegrounds between science, morality, and freedom. And perhaps the greatest irony of all? What began as a tool of control became a symbol of rebellion. So the next time you hear that familiar hum, remember what it used to mean. It's not just vibration, it's reclamation. Subscribe to Seductive History Time if you believe the past should never be silenced, especially the parts that make us uncomfortable. Because history isn't always about heroes. Sometimes it's about those who were never allowed to be one. Every day, history hides in plain sight, disguised as medicine, morality, and care. Welcome back to Seductive History Time, where we pull back the curtain on the stories that polite history forgot. We challenge the myths, expose the systems of control masquerading as compassion, and illuminate the uncomfortable. Truths that never made it into textbooks. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next revelation, because the story you're about to hear is one of the most disturbing intersections of medicine, sexuality, and profit ever recorded. In our next episode, we'll dive into the medieval bedding ceremony, a ritual where wedding guests escorted the bride and groom to the marriage bed, often staying to witness the consummation. It was public, it was ritualized, and it reveals how sex and reproduction were never private affairs in medieval society. But before that, let's finish what we started, because hysteria, the so-called female disease, wasn't real. It was a lie dressed in Latin, a diagnosis invented to pathologize normal emotions, desires, and frustrations in women. And while some doctors might have believed in their own pseudoscience, others understood exactly what they were selling. Dr. Robert Batty, a respected American gynecologist, published an account in 1872 that reveals the truth hidden behind euphemism. He described a patient suffering from pelvic congestion and nervous irritability. His treatment? What he called local manipulation. He noted that the procedure provided immediate relief and improved mood. Of course, he never wrote the word orgasm. Instead, he buried it under a mountain of clinical language, turning sexual release into therapeutic success. That phrase, local manipulation, became a code, a linguistic shield. It meant whatever doctors wanted it to mean, and its vagueness protected them from scandal. Women's own voices are harder to find. Victorian respectability didn't allow women to describe these experiences openly, even in private letters. But a few accounts survived. One letter from 1889, found in a medical archive, tells of a woman writing to her sister. She describes visiting a nervous specialist. The treatment, she writes, was embarrassing but effective. She felt restored afterward, and her doctor recommended weekly sessions. She doesn't name the treatment. She didn't have to. The pattern is unmistakable. Again and again, women described procedures that were embarrassing, but left them feeling calm, relieved, light, and renewed. Doctors claimed they were curing illness, but they were prescribing a ritual of medicalized pleasure, one that cost money, reinforced dependency, and framed women's bodies as both the source of pathology and the site of profit. Let's talk about that profit. In the 1890s, a typical hysteria session cost between 50 cents and $2, depending on the physician's reputation. That's roughly $15 to $60 today, affordable enough for middle-class women, but lucrative enough to build careers. A single doctor treating 20 patients a week at $1 each earned $1 a month, over $2,400 in modern value, just from this one practice. Multiply that by dozens of practitioners, hundreds of women, and thousands of weekly sessions, and you begin to see the scale of the enterprise. This wasn't fringe medicine. It was big business. Doctors didn't just treat hysteria. They depended on it. Class divisions made the system even more perverse. Wealthy women could afford private appointments, either at home or in elite clinics. Middle-class women went to crowded offices. And poor women? They were left out entirely, unable to access the treatments that wealthier women received under the guise of medicine. So access to sexual relief, disguised as therapy, became a privilege of class. The bourgeois woman's pleasure was sterilized by medical legitimacy. The working-class woman's was condemned as sin. Respectable women received orgasms from doctors in private offices. Poor women were punished for seeking them elsewhere. Medicine had turned sexuality into both hierarchy and hypocrisy. Some doctors even became celebrities. In London, Dr. J. Russell Walker reportedly treated over 100 women a week for nervous conditions. In Chicago, Dr. Franklin H. Martin built an entire fortune treating female disorders. They lectured, published papers, and were celebrated in professional circles for their sensitivity and skill. What they were really doing, behind closed doors, under the halo of respectability, was redefining control as compassion. And not every doctor was comfortable with that contradiction. Medical journals from the time contain revealing complaints. Physicians described manual treatments as tedious, physically demanding, and embarrassing. One British doctor, writing in 1883, lamented that such work caused severe hand fatigue and took far too long. He wasn't just exhausted, he was frustrated by inefficiency. A treatment could take up to an hour. That's not good business. Then came salvation, not for the women but for the doctors. The mechanical vibrator changed everything. It turned a time-consuming, labor-intensive process into something fast, efficient, and profitable. A treatment that once took 45 minutes could now be completed in 10. Doctors could treat more patients, charge the same rates, and spare themselves the physical inconvenience. The machines paid for themselves quickly. Within months, they became indispensable tools in medical offices across Europe and America. This wasn't progress. It was scalability. Medicine had found a way to industrialize female pleasure while keeping women themselves out of control. Imagine being one of those women, walking into a doctor's office, anxious, ashamed, desperate to be cured of something you were told was an illness. You lie down, close your eyes, and submit to treatment. It feels good, too good. But you don't say that. You can't. Because it isn't supposed to be pleasure. It's medicine. You pay, thank the doctor, and leave. Relieved, confused, and still trapped in a system that sold your own body back to you. This was not liberation. It was exploitation polished to look like progress. So when we look back at the story of Hysteria and the Vibrator, we shouldn't just laugh at Victorian prudishness. We should recognize the structure it built, a structure that still echoes in the modern world. The one that says, you're not sick, but you'll pay for the cure anyway. Medicine may have abandoned the term hysteria, but it hasn't abandoned the habit of defining women through their symptoms, and that's why telling these stories matters. If this episode made you question how history defines health, share it. If you see the same patterns today in how women's bodies are diagnosed, marketed, or monetized, talk about it, because silence is where control thrives. This is Seductive History Time, where we expose the systems that pretended to heal while quietly holding the scalpel. Subscribe, share, and comment below. What shocked you most, the language, the prophet, or the way history repeats itself? And remember, hysteria was never real, but the control it created still is. History often hides its cruelty behind the mask of care. Some women, perhaps many, found real comfort in the very system that exploited them, not simply because of the physical relief these treatments provided, but because, for once, someone listened. For countless Victorian women whose pain was dismissed as weakness, sin, or female nerves, a doctor's attention meant something profound. It was validation, a signal that their suffering was real. In an era when women's emotions were treated as moral failures, having a physician examine, diagnose, and treat them could feel like compassion. And that's what makes this history so complicated. The system was exploitative, built on pseudoscience and patriarchal control. But within that same system, individual women found genuine relief. They felt better. They felt seen. And some doctors, misguided but not malicious, truly believed they were helping. Yet no matter how humane the intentions or how real the relief, the structure itself remained one of control, not care. Medicalizing female sexuality, requiring male authority for female pleasure, disguising sexual release as medical necessity. Every element served one purpose: to keep women's bodies under professional and therefore male supervision. It wasn't liberation. It was a velvet cage. The ripple effects of this system spread far beyond the examining room. The widespread diagnosis of hysteria didn't just medicalize women's emotions, it redefined womanhood itself. It declared that women were biologically unstable, emotionally fragile, and mentally inferior. Textbooks told generations of young doctors that a woman's uterus ruled her mind, that her emotions were governed by hormones, not reason, that her intellect, her ambition, her dissatisfaction, all of it were symptoms, not individuality. Every anxiety, every frustration, every cry for freedom became proof of an illness called femininity. And that diagnosis didn't stay in hospitals. It seeped into the courts, the schools, and the law. If women were hysterical, they couldn't vote. If they were emotional, they couldn't own property. If they were unstable, they couldn't raise children without supervision. A medical label became a social weapon, justifying exclusion, dependency, and silence. And the cruelest irony? The very society that declared women sick was the one making them sick. Women suffered because corsets restricted their breathing, because their education was denied, because their ambitions were mocked, because their marriages offered obedience, not intimacy. They were anxious because they were confined, depressed because they were powerless, frustrated because they were human in a world that didn't allow them to be. Victorian medicine called this hysteria, but what it really was protest. It was a perfect circular trap. Society made women miserable, then declared their misery proof of inferiority. Doctors prescribed obedience as the cure, then used their authority to enforce it. And when women fought back, when they refused the diagnosis, their defiance was pathologized as yet another symptom. A woman who questioned her doctor risked being locked away by him. Resistance became insanity. Self-defense became disease. Feminists of the time saw through it. Writers like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who penned the yellow wallpaper based on her own rest cure, exposed the horror behind the facade of treatment. She wrote of a woman confined, infantilized, and driven to madness by a doctor who called her hysteria rest. It wasn't fiction. It was metaphorical truth. Gilman's critique was radical for her time, but the establishment dismissed her as hysterical. Even rebellion was renamed pathology. The system had built itself a perfect defense. Any woman who resisted could be declared insane for resisting. That's why this story matters. Beyond the scandal and the shock value, the history of Hysteria and the Vibrator is a case study in how authority cloaks control in compassion. It's the story of how pseudoscience becomes accepted practice, how profit grows from prejudice, and how entire industries flourish by controlling bodies they claim to heal. When you understand this pattern, you start to see it everywhere. When normal variations of female sexuality are labeled as disorders, when unnecessary procedures are sold as empowerment, when medicine turns natural experience into marketable pathology, every time that happens, history repeats itself quietly, efficiently, profitably. The vibrator's journey from doctor's office to bedroom marks real progress, yes. But it's also a reminder. For decades, this same technology existed not to liberate women, but to contain them. It was a tool of control disguised as therapy, a way to make pleasure permissible only when prescribed by a man. So while today's devices symbolize autonomy, the legacy behind them warns us never to forget the cost of that freedom. Because for centuries, medicine didn't just diagnose women. It defined them, and every time history medicalizes what it fears, it tells us less about biology and more about power. Never forget. That phrase isn't just about the past. It's about now. Because the systems that once called desire disease still echo in the language of diagnosis, in the marketing of medicine, and in the quiet spaces where authority decides what it means to be healthy. Understanding how control once wore the face of care is the first step to recognizing when it still does.